Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today's episode 13 of our secular Bible study series, in which we are looking at 1 Chronicles. Now, this is probably the most skipped book of the whole Bible. If I had to guess, if you're reading in canon order, you get to 1 Chronicles, you start to read it. The first 9 out of 29 chapters are just a genealogy. Then you start reading. It seems to be just the same stories that you already knew about from 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, and you probably just go straight to Ezra. Now, I'm going to encourage you not to do that, and I'm going to encourage you not to skip this episode or the next one. I did debate on if I should put these two together, but I'm going to be consistent here. One book per Thursday. So today we're looking at just 1 Chronicles. There is some new information here, and there is some really interesting things going on. There's also some things being built that we're definitely going to refer back to as we progress through the rest of the Bible. So I'll be really careful not to be too redundant here, but that means you need to have watched 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. All that out of the way, let's move right into point 1, which is book overview. So what is the purpose here? This is a retelling and a reframing. Typically in the Jewish tradition, this book would come at the very end. Like the previous books, 1st and 2nd Chronicles were definitely one book technically that have just been divided for our reading purposes due to scroll length. And there's really two main concepts here. First, we want to establish the Messiah or the Messianic reign. That's why all the genealogies are so important. And we also want to take a look back about the priesthood and start tracking that. So it comes to David, really is our center point here for the Messianic side. And then we start with Aaron and go all the way through for the priest side. So this Messianic promise that God makes to David is so vitally important. And that means we need a better David. And so this book just whitewashes David. He is only painted in a positive light. None of the bad things he did, like cowering from Saul or sleeping with Bathsheba, happen in this book. So you can make an argument that they weren't purposely trying to leave these things out because they still would have expected readers to see the accounts that happened in 1st and 2nd Samuel. And I think there's some fairness there. This is, though, a retelling, a reframing. We're trying to create something that we can point to as David being the example for what Christ will become. We get comparisons with David being like Moses. So we're elevating David's already greatness in these stories to something much higher, and putting him up on this pedestal allows us to say no one since David has been able to measure up. None of these other kings have been the Messiah. He is yet to come, and when he comes, he will be like David. And now we have a cleaner David, a more divine David, etc. But I am getting ahead of myself. The first 9 chapters here are all about genealogies, and man, it's terrible to look at them. It's wonderful to compare them later on, especially when we're talking about biblical contradictions, and then when we're actually trying to map out, did Jesus truly make it from these genealogies? Are they consistent? Can we track it? This book is a book of vital importance for that. And there's a lot of theological reasons why we have to keep this bloodline so pure. The main one being that we need to tie it back to God's promise to David. We need to see the fulfillment of this. So again, genealogies, boring, but important. We need to know who we're working with, all the important players. This is their time to just get their name in one more time. This was their order. This is their importance. Let's move on. Another big theme here, besides, again, the Messianic promise and the priesthood, is the temple itself. Now, we've already heard a little bit about the temple. We know that Solomon made the temple with the plans of David. David was not allowed to make the temple, and that's something we'll talk about in point 7 that I didn't talk about the first time that it came up, and there's some inconsistencies there, so we'll get to that. But here we see much more new information. So, to make up for all the information that got deleted about David, we now get new stories about David. And one of the new stories is all about God telling him how to build the temple. And this is, I think, supposed to be important, again, raising David up to the level of Moses, where God is giving Moses such specific instructions on how to build the tabernacle. So that's really about it for book overview. The main point here that I think we're supposed to glean is the future hope. What's to come? If you consider what we're going to get into in point 2 here with authorship and date, we need something to look forward to. So let's just get into authorship and date. Again, there's a few different ideas here. The typical Jewish tradition is that Ezra wrote this. Ezra's book of the Bible comes right after 1st and 2nd Chronicles. He's a very important priestly figure, and so there's an idea here that he is kind of re-putting this together, putting the spin on for what's going to be coming next. I think it's very clear that not only is this multiple strains of authorship, but that we have a compilation of sorts. We have very, very different tones, word choice, limited understandings or points of knowledge, etc., that look very mixed together. We can really pick out multiple identifiers here. So that's probably much more realistic. I don't think there's any scholars that still hold to the idea that Ezra actually wrote these books. Mainly what's up for debate here is this pre-exile or post-exile. Again, with the idea of this reframing being so important, it seems very much post-exile after Cyrus the Great makes the decree allowing the Jewish people to return. Okay, so if, hey, we're back and now we've got our promise from God still, we made it back to the holy city, we get to look forward to the Messiah now. Let's get our story straight. We have all of these things that have been floating around during this entire time of captivity and before. We have oral traditions, we have court records, we have other written records, we have lineages, we have law. Let's get this down. And hey, let's start keeping track a little better. We've done some lineages and genealogies. Let's get it all, thus the 9 chapters, thus the name Chronicles. And so the post-exile seems to be the better idea, although this obviously could have also happened pre or during. So let's move straight into point 3, which is going to be historical accuracy and background and context and things of this nature. We don't have much. Really, the only new information that we get that we can kind of post up against is going to be all the details about the temple, but we have like no archaeological evidence for Solomon's temple. We do understand from a historical context the importance of a couple of things, like the transfer of the Ark of the Covenant. That's great. This practice of venerating sacred objects and associating them with divine importance. The other part that's important to understand as we talk about historical context, especially in this book, is the excuse that is often made of this being a theological work. We've heard it time and time again with every other book so far that we've covered. This is not supposed to be a science book. This is not supposed to be a history book. This is not a biography, etc. Even though we're absolutely supposed to assume many of those things as literal. What trumps the literal importance of accuracy is the theological message. And that would ring more true in First Chronicles than elsewhere. This is also the big excuse that we get as we see the contradictions that happened in, say, First Chronicles versus something in Kings or Samuel. That, oh, well, who cares if we got those dates wrong or we got the years wrong or we got the genealogies wrong, because it's the essence. What we're trying to show is the messianic example and just an overall claim that it will be from the line of David to fulfill prophecy. Nothing more. So yeah, we're leaving out the bad stories about David, but we're just trying to build a framework here. We're trying to build an ideal, an image to live up to. And that would be fine if that's what the text said, and that would be fine if they didn't give us 1,000 details that were to be taken literally, that can be falsified, or at best, in the case of actually trying to believe any of this, not verified. It's just so vague and nondescript in the parts where we should be able to document things, and then hyper-specific in the realm of, well, we just can't know. This was obviously just an oral tradition passed down. So the overall idea of this being an accurate, reliable source of historical data does not get any help from this, because we see it stretched here in this reframing even more so than in previous books. So let's move straight into point 4, which is literary analysis. And this has multiple things going on. One, it's a narrative account, especially including the genealogies. It is a recapping to add importance to previously mentioned subjects. So we have repetition at play, we have parallelism at play, lots of symbolism and theological import. We get a method of idealization showing us the important parts of spiritual worship, again with the focus on the temple and the focus on the priest that have been brought into this book that have been lacking really since Leviticus. And really it's just this separation between here's what we've covered, but here's what you should have focused on. Theological importance once again. But yeah, I think I've kind of exhausted that. So let's move straight into point 5, main themes. Theme 1, I would say, is religious devotion. We really double down on David here, and we double down on the good aspects of David, and this is where we get the idea of David's greatest strength being his unwavering faith. We saw that in the narratives back in Samuel, and we still see it here in the retellings and the new information that we get in First Chronicles. Religious devotion is what has always brought this people group out from under their bad circumstances, from their oppression, winning battles when they're the underdog, fleeing Egypt, etc. It has been about when we turn and we face God again, as opposed to when we turn and face away. A second theme just has to be the importance of lineage and ancestry. 1, it's showing the interconnectedness even amongst all of the tribes. And then 2, again, highlighting David's specific role in bringing forth the Messiah from his line, and even what came before David going up to Judah. A third theme, and it seems strange here, is again, we come back around to the importance of the priesthood. Like I said earlier, this has been really dropped since Leviticus. There's been some things like happened in Numbers, etc. But really, once we got into the judges and then the monarchy and had the prophets like Nathan and Samuel and Gad, etc., we really lost focus on the role of the priest. And that seems to be observed here by these writers. And they're saying, hey, here's the importance again. We're getting back to the fundamentals. Let's talk about the temple. Let's talk about the kind of priest we need and what their role is and what their rules are. Let's talk about how we engage with God. Again, it's just this fresh start is what the feeling is. We have to lay the groundwork, but we're going to start building again. And then last would be, of course, the importance of being obedient to God. And here it's so funny because they only again highlight David's successes and attribute that to being obedient to God, and then remind us of how Saul wasn't obedient in his downfall, which is just hilarious not to like look at David's downfall and use that as the comparison. But we've got to build this David up. He's got to be a holy character for us. It is really just funny to see the editing happen within what was already a collected part of Scripture. It's just fascinating because then when you hear that, oh, the New Testament was also trying to do this, and people are like, they wouldn't do that. No one's trying to make any legend or lore here. No one's trying to build anything up. This is just what the truth was. It's like they did it already within their own Jewish tradition of this God and of the patriarchs of this religion. They have no problem doing this and just labeling it theological importance. Moving on to point 6, this one will be really quick. Reception and influence. Again, not a lot here. We don't have a lot of new information, and I'm not going to be redundant. The biggest one, of course, is just if we're talking about, moving into the New Testament with Matthew 1 through 17, we get the genealogies that are connecting Jesus back to David. So it's really important, and it's called on in the first book, in the first chapter of the New Testament, referencing back to here what we see in First Chronicles. So again, the setup is really important, even if the payoff doesn't come for quite a long time. But this isn't like all the great works that are going to be put on the stained glass and that have made it into the operas and things of this nature. This is just Chronicles. It's important to the Jewish tradition for obvious reasons, as we've stated many times, and to the Christian tradition as well for establishing Jesus, which is the main focus, of course, for the Christian side of things. The only other thing you might be able to milk out of this for reception influence is, again, getting back to the temple worship, having an idea of what is the right way to encounter God, to address God, to try to meet God. This has trickled down a little bit even into like modern day worship services. I mean, we see a lot with the choir that is going to be kind of on hand here for the temple. But yeah, that's pretty much it for reception influence. Let's get into point 7, which is really broken down into 2 parts now, and that's just going to be our contradictions and our problematic passages. Let's start with contradictions, and I'm going to again try not to repeat any that we've had, but I might get into a couple. The biggest contradiction just right off the bat without getting specific in verse is just the difference that we have in the character of David. A very complicated man that has both pleased and disgraced God, that has been both rewarded and punished by God, is now just the better of the two. This is a huge discrepancy, and it's very purposeful, and it's obvious. Even the good parts of the David story have some interesting contradictions within themselves. The events as described for, say, the story of David and Goliath from 1 Samuel 17 versus 1 Chronicles 20 have some differences. So even within a story that should be nothing but net gain for the character of David, we still didn't quite get the correct and same accounting. 2 Samuel 24 versus 1 Chronicles 21 is, I think, the biggest one. I covered that back when we were doing 2 Samuel. This is when David takes the census, which was awful for reasons that I still do not understand. And it says in one of them that God incited David to do it, and in the other it says that Satan incited David to do it. After I mentioned that, I got flooded with excuses in the comments and within emails about how dumb I was to not understand that God uses Satan sometimes, especially in the Old Testament, to fulfill his will. And I don't really care. That's still just a horrific thing. There's no good version of this. David and many other people are punished tremendously. In fact, what ended up happening, 70,000 people died because David wanted to count, but David didn't want to do it. Either God made him do it, or God used Satan to do it, or Satan did it. We either have a sheer contradiction, or we have God purposely causing something that he knows will make him have to enact punishment that will lead to 70,000 innocent people being murdered. So play with that as you will. There's no good version. In 2 Samuel 6 versus 1 Chronicles 13, we get different stories about why Uzziah died from the ark. One is that he transported it incorrectly, and another is simply that he touched it. 2 Samuel 24 and 1 Chronicles 21. 1 have a difference in the size of David's army, a very large difference. The list of David's sons differs from 1 Samuel 5 versus 2 Chronicles 3, 2 Samuel 5 versus 1 Chronicles 3. We have chronological order differences in 2 Samuel versus 1 Chronicles, things like when David gets anointed king and the capture of Jerusalem. These happen in different orders, which I think is kind of a big deal. One thing that I think is hilarious is that for a book that is focused so much on the importance of genealogies, we get differences in genealogies versus in other books. Variations in name and in generation can be seen in both the Old and the New Testament when compared with this list. David's death and final instructions to Solomon changes between 1 Kings and 1 Chronicles. And some of these differences, like again, even with the relationship between Saul and David, they don't necessarily change details, they change emphasis, which again is that reframing, right? Like I'm using that word pretty carefully because it's not so much that some things are different, although some things wholly are, but even in the things that are the same, where we're looking at it, from what angle, from what perspective, for what point of importance is vastly different. Even David's plans for the temple are quite different here. And not just because we get more information, but we actually get some information that is in direct opposition with other related passages. So there's more. Again, there's a lot we could go through, but I think for time, we'll just move straight into the problematic passages. And this is going to be shorter too. I'm going to list the same passages that are problematic in case you want to go look them up here in this book. But I think we only have 2 or 3 new ones that we get to cover. So the whole census thing happens in 1 Chronicles 21 verse 1. The 70,000 that God kills because of that happens in verse 14. 1 Chronicles 28:3 is where we get the retelling that David could not build the temple himself because he had shed blood. But Solomon did some very horrendous things. And so I'm not sure, there just seems to be inconsistency there, but I think that most of the blood that David shed, especially in this retelling that we get in 1 Chronicles, is all the good stuff that the Lord commanded. I mean, the reason that the Lord made David king or got to dethrone Saul is because Saul refused to kill one king and a few goats, sheep or whatever, when he was supposed to completely commit genocide on every single living thing and did not. But who was willing to follow God's commands to the very letter of the law? David. David's got no problem with this. You ask him to get 100 foreskins, he's going to cut you off 200 foreskins. So punishing him for that seems silly. And it is a punishment. David is begging, I think it is in 1 Samuel, maybe 2 Samuel, to build this temple for God. And God's like, thanks, but no thanks, bro. So I think that's really interesting and worth looking at further. This next one I'll just read so I get the numbers right. This is chapter 23, verse 3 and 4. The Levites, 30 years old and upward, were numbered, and the total was 38,000 men. 24,000 of these, David said, shall have charge of the work in the house of the Lord. 6,000 shall be officers and judges, 4,000 gatekeepers, and 4,000 shall offer praises to the Lord. So taking that many men, tens of thousands of people to sing or play an instrument or stand in front of a gate just makes no sense. And if it is to be taken seriously because God requires this big of a tithe, I mean, what is that, like 2/3? Is that the best use of resources? We see that from this point, we have many famines, we have people eating their babies, we have people having to flee to other countries and get punished for it, etc. Like, maybe some of these men could have been out hunting or harvesting or something else. So even if the story is all true and these numbers are all correct and it's all about God's glory, to whose detriment? As typical, I don't understand why humans have to suffer and die for God to be so praised. This concept is so built into the foundation of this religion that I think it doesn't get questioned nearly as much as it should. If I created something, me, lowly Brandon, not perfect, not almighty, I would do my darndest to make sure that it thrives along with me, that we thrive together. But it's always at someone else's detriment that God is praised. Someone else's sacrifice, someone else's bloodshed, something dying. These are the things that please God. The sweet scent of flesh offered up. It really is quite sick when you step away from it enough. I'd encourage you to all read the last third when we start talking about the temple and the divisions, because each chapter is its own thing. David organizes the priest, David organizes the musicians, he organizes the gatekeepers, etc. And you can just see how much goes in to preparing a house for God versus how much went into God preparing a place for us. Within all these temple accountings, by the way, just in terms of problematic passages, I won't give you the actual verses, but if you were to read this, there's many strange things said, like David saying that God gave him the ability to understand all of these things, like the actual structural architecture, etc. Like, did God just matrix style implant geometry in David's brain? It's all very, very strange. But again, I mean, this wouldn't take much considering he taught Noah, an old man, how to build a huge ark. But there's just these mythological concepts that are brought into something that is otherwise so very rational at times and simple. So just worth pointing out. Towards the end of the book, we do get an interesting verse in chapter 29, verses 17. I know, my God, that you test the heart and have pleasure in uprightness. I think just right there, just again, this idea of God knowing what we're going to do and being satisfied or dissatisfied, rewarding and or punishing is... You guys remember the movie Minority Report, where you're judged early based off the premonitions that are supposedly always correct of these like triplets, and Tom Cruise has to go collect murderers before they even make the kill? That is always what I think of when I read verses like this, and there's multiple verses like this where God is, again, not only seeing the intentions of the heart, but testing them. And I think that's such a strange and incorrect concept to be held accountable. Like, I guess you could just say, well, God's omniscient. He knows what everyone's going to do, but this isn't the verbiage that's used. God's doing these tests on who we are and finding our shortcomings when we don't even know about them or haven't even acted on them, which seems like God's problems, right? Like, if you designed a creature, purely your design with your foreknowledge, allowed him to be created where his very essence was testable, to come out poor, to come out sinful, to come out against you, who did that? Not me, not David, right? I think it's more evidence here for not only thought crime, but further than that, really just being made and being found guilty. Next week, we'll get into 2 Chronicles. There's quite a bit more that happens here. And again, kind of the final reframing and setup before we move into books like Ezra and Nehemiah. And we're really cooking. So thanks for watching. Those of you that are enjoying these, I really appreciate your viewership. And until next time, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tier Iconoclast patrons, Shawn Skaggs and Jason Rollins, and my atheist advocate patron, Jarrod Nichols, for their incredible generosity. Also, a big shout out to my secular scholar patrons, of which we have some new ones. All other patrons are listed in the description of each video. Please consider joining this great group if you enjoy these videos or believe in my mission. Thanks, and have a great day.